Well, hello, and thank you so much for tuning into my podcast. This is Yadida Span. I am a mom. I call that a MOM. That's a mom on the move. I'm an author of a book entitled Don't Give Up. It's on Amazon. Go ahead and grab a copy. What else? A mompreneur, motivational speaker, also an empowerment coach. And most of all, I am a human. And I'm touched by real life issues that people face every day. And so on this particular episode, first of all, thank you so much for tuning in. I want to talk to you about homelessness. Once again, those of you who have not tuned in with me before, I say this is a live podcast. I like to kind of spend time with you and real things happen. Hopefully the cat won't run across my phone or anything like that, or my daughter won't go, "Mommy," while I'm on the podcast. But if it happens, that's just me letting you know that we should never let anything stop us from using our voice, our gifts, and our talent. So, the face of homelessness. I'm really touched by this particular podcast just because of an encounter I had earlier this week. When I was out with my daughter, I met a couple, a really lovely couple, a husband and a wife. And I'm telling you right now, they looked like they could be models, beautiful people. She was just really beautiful. He was so handsome. And they were walking, and, as we walked past, he said something like, "Do you have anything you can share?" And, I heard, but I looked, my daughter was like, "Oh, mommy," mommy. And I said, "Oh, okay." And, kind of walked a little, towards them, and they came over towards us. And, he said, do you have anything you can share?" And at that moment, the only thing that I knew to do, of course, was to encourage them and to let them know that they were seen and that they were heard at that moment. And I know that that was important because I get it. There are times when many people feel threatened by people who are, quote unquote, homeless. I'm saying that like that because it looks like in many cases the word homeless has become more of a category than a group of people. A group of people who were probably one paycheck away from being without a place to live. And it happens more than we know. But I think a lot of times people don't get to share their story. And I've heard before where people say, "Oh, no one wants to hear your story." But guess what? People's stories are very, very important. Our stories are actually what shape us into who we are today. However we got here, whether it was easy, whether it was not, our stories have a huge part to play in who we are. And so for this couple, they had a story as well. But in their current situation, their story depicted a space where they were oftentimes ignored. And the one thing that he said, and I've heard this before, he said, "Thank you so much for taking time to even talk to us. A lot of people don't even stop and say anything. They'll turn their noses up at us. They'll frown at us. They'll look at us like, we're just filthy and nothing." And that touched my heart for various reasons. Because you all know I'm a woman of faith, right? And yes, I love God. Don't tune off for those of you who don't. I want you to still listen, because this is talking about humanity. It's talking about human beings who sometimes fall into places where they never thought they would be. We just don't know how we get there, and sometimes we do. Yes, I'll admit, sometimes it's a poor choice in our finances, but I realize this too. Not everyone knows how to manage a bank account, a checkbook. People really do have to be taught these things, and they may try. They may really, really want to try to do a good job at it and say, "Hey, I can do this." But we just sometimes need the skills. Sometimes people just need someone to stop and show them how. And so as we began to talk to this couple, like I said, I don't even know if they were angels at this point. You know, there's a scripture that says that we entertain angels unawares, and that's why it's important for us to be kind, to show empathy. And if you've never been in the situation, I get it. It's hard to show empathy if you don't know what it's like to be without. But that does not mean, because some have never experienced it, that they don't need to listen, to care, to even help when they have it or the ability to do so. You know, there's a lot of judgment that comes when it comes to people who are in need and people who are homeless. We hear about it all the time. A lot of people, you know, they don't want to even go for the help, because if you listen to the story, sometimes it's a professor. Sometimes, I'll use an example. It's a person who went through a situation. I can share a brief when we moved into a place, and regretfully, we were promised one thing, but on our move-in date, it was something completely different. And I know it was God who had me walk into that apartment before they, actually gave me the key, because the door was open. I had already paid for the lease and what have you, and it was supposed to be renovated and all these things. That's how they got me to sign the lease. But when I went in, I was kind of shocked to see the mouse droppings. And, when maintenance walked in behind me and said, I didn't even know you were moving in. They never told us. And so basically, we were lied to. And it was about 5. And I said, what is this on this stove? Pull that stove out. They pulled out the stove, and there were big gaping holes behind the stove, in the closet. All of those things. And it's been months of having to go back and forth and taking pictures and being told things that are not necessarily true. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever moved into a place and it wasn't everything that you needed it to be? They moved us into another apartment, and there's mold in here, and you could smell it the minute that you walked in. And the one thing that the management would say was, I don't go into that apartment. That apartment smells like mold. I don't go in there. And then the story continuously changed, and I had to keep praying that God would help me. Because you're very concerned, especially when you have children, right? You don't want anything to happen. You want to be a great parent. But what happens when someone's trying to pull the wool over your eyes? What happens to people when they fall into spaces where they lose their job, their financial stability? What happens when there's a woman and a man who it's not working out, and sometimes there's DV and she's got to run for her life with her children? And maybe he was the sole breadwinner, because maybe he said, I don't want you to work. I want you to stay inside. I want you to whatever, or vice versa, if it's a woman who said that to a man. And when things don't work out and you end up having to try to make it on one income, it's hard enough for people having 2. And then you have 1. And sometimes you have none. What happens when your life changes? And you don't even know who it is that you can really share with, who you can really talk to about what you're experiencing. Because you know that there will be some people who will say, stick it out. Some people who will say, you should have done better. Some people who will say, you shouldn't have spoken up. You should just keep your mouth shut and let people treat you any kind of way and subject yourself to environmental issues that you know are not good for your body. But they're not in your situation. Would they live in a house full of mold? Would they live in a house when they weren't promised mouse droppings? It came as a freebie. You never expected that. And what about this husband and wife? What about people whose homes are burned and they don't have family that they can go to? Some people have family around that they can go to. Family that can even help. That's not always the case. And so people find themselves in a homeless situation. And some people prefer to sleep out on park benches because the little bit that they do have left, how many of you know you can't walk around with your couch on your back? So here in this space, I've watched people's items, their couches and recliner chairs and television screens and all kinds of things be thrown out in the dumpster. Part ways, I think I know what happened. I think that they thought they could stick it out. I'm not going to pay my rent. This is not what you promised me. We're in here. I've heard of people who moved into this particular complex, and some of the black mold, I mean, I know I was told I was allergic to. I don't exactly claim that. But some people, it just doesn't affect their bodies well, and neither should you be placed in a place where there is mold and all types of other things, unwantables. But, you know, you see them and you hear that they've gone to the hospital, and you see other people who try to stick it out and, you know, say, you know, they're have their apartments flooded. And if you've experienced that, that's a horrible thing. Flooding coming down from the ceiling onto your computers and all these things do happen if you've never experienced it. And so some people may choose to say, well, I'm not going to pay, or I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go into a shelter because this mold is making you feel sick. You don't want to be there. You never thought you would get there, but you find yourself in this category called homeless. But more than the category, it's a human being. And when we start to look more at categories than at humans, and we lose this thing that's called empathy, that's a very, very sad state of affairs. It is sad. When we get to the place when we say, well, it's not me, it's them. Or they could have done better, they should have done better. And we never stop to sit down on the side of the road and listen. And I get it. Some people are facing mental illness, and so no, you're not going to sit down and talk to everyone. But can't you say a prayer? Can't you give a smile? They already feel forgotten. They already feel like, how did I get there? If they're in their right mind enough to even think that. And let's talk about that. The whole thing about mental illness and people being quote unquote crazy and all of those things. Do we ever poke fun at a person who has high blood pressure or cancer or diabetes or lupus or anything like that? Those diseases affect organs. But diseases that affect the brain, it's an organ. It's going to look different. It's going to cause the person to act differently because it's the brain. And the brain, when it's working, you know, at its optimal level, it shows up differently. It makes us, you know, walk and be able to correspond with people. But when it's not, and there's an illness, and people can't get the meds that they need to get if they lost their job, or they try to get, you know, Medicaid and different things like that. But if you don't have an address sometimes, you can't always get the help that you need. And it's an epidemic. And it's a sad state of affairs. I love the fact that the Bible says the poor you will have with you always. He's mindful. God is mindful of the poor. And if God is mindful, can't we be mindful too? So here's this couple, and you know, God is so good because I wrote my book, and that day I had sold some copies of the book, and it wasn't much. You know, I love the word philanthropy, and sometimes we think we've got to have, you know, big amounts of money. Wait till I become a philanthropist, thousands of dollars. But what if it's just that little bit that you have that's enough to put a smile on someone's face? And I was able, with the little bit that I had, I was able to give just so they could maybe go sit down and have a little something, you know, a little dinner together. And no, I didn't want to say no. And it's not that I had a whole lot, but it was something And as I looked at them, I said to them, I said, would you mind if we said a word of prayer? Can I